We are going to continue to talk about rate design, and with us for our last panel is Russ Feingold, Vice President, Rates and Regulatory Practice for Black & Veatch Management Consulting. Tom just realized I pulled a funny on him. I switched out our waters. Mine was full and his was empty, so it's like, anyway. We're getting punchy here at the end, guys. Yeah. Danny Wagner, Senior Manager, Regulatory Transformation for Advanced Energy Economy. Jennifer Kefer, Executive Director. Did I say that right, Jennifer?
Kefer's right.
Okay, Kefer for Executive Director for the Alliance for Industrial Efficiency, and Jamie Scripps, who is a Principal at Five Lakes Energy. Thank you very much for your participation. I'm kidding about being punchy. We are fully engaged, despite this being the last panel of Power Forward. We greatly appreciate your participation today. Russ, we'll begin with you.
Okay. Thanks, Chairman Hawk. Commissioners, staff of the Commission, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's kind of interesting as an aside, I've been here since Tuesday hearing the presentations, and when the agenda first came out, I said to myself, well, we're the last panel on the last day, so obviously most, if not all, of the important points will have been covered, so I won't have much to say. The reality is, although I'm going to hold myself to my own slides, I feel like I want to get the last word in rebuttal before the case is closed. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here. To set the record straight, I am not the ex-U.S. Senator of Wisconsin. That's a different Russ Feingold. And I'm here to tell you that I will tell you where the origin of straight fixed variable came from. It came from the mid-1980s at FERC with the interstate natural gas pipeline rate-making process. Interestingly, it wasn't even straight fixed variable. Originally, it was called modified straight fixed variable because when FERC deregulated the pipelines back in the mid-80s, they actually said we wanted to put the return and income taxes of the pipeline in the variable portion of the rate, and all of the other costs would go in the fixed or the demand charge. Over time, they decided to move away from that and went to what was called straight fixed variable, where all of the fixed costs go in the contract demand charge, all of the variable costs, which are very few for a pipeline, went into the commodity charge. So we have solved the mystery. My talk is here to sort of present sort of the transition that we're going through and speak from the trenches. My organization has been involved in a lot of the proceedings going on in states like Arizona, Nevada, New Hampshire recently, Connecticut now, and the debate that's been going on with regard to what is the appropriate price for DER customers, and how do you set it? So that's going to sort of be the context. But there are three things I'd like to cover today. First, I'd like to talk about the interplay between the concept of cost incurrence versus cost avoidance, because both of those concepts come into play, at least in the transition that we're going through towards DER pricing. So what are the implications of those concepts for rate design purposes? And then I'd also like to talk about how do you balance those concepts through rates which provide benefits to the customer and to the utility system. So that's sort of what I'm teeing up here. This next slide, if you ask yourself the question, what are we trying to achieve? Many of these objectives are not new to all of you. You've seen them before. But I guess my point is we can't lose sight of these in the transition, and because of the process that we go through before regulatory bodies, these objectives have to be addressed in one way, shape, or form. The last one being, what about just and reasonable rates for non-DER customers? And that's really where the debate has been at some of these states that I mentioned. And the bottom line is, how do you achieve a fair rate-making balance? fair rate-making balance, in my view, is all in the eyes of the beholder. If you get 5 people in a room to conduct cost of service studies, you're probably going to get 5 different answers. However, cost tends to be the most objective measure that we have in setting rates, and then all of the other aspects are non-cost considerations that may or may not come into play. So it's really trying to find the happy medium. What is that balance? And I'll try to walk through some considerations on that. In my mind, when we talk about DER customers, and I'm focusing more so on residential distributed energy resource customers with solar, rooftop, and so forth, there are 2 questions, but 2 separate questions that I think we have to ask ourselves. How does the utility recover its fixed T&D costs associated with the grid, which is in existence today? And then how should a DER customer be compensated for its generation of electricity? And we've talked throughout the week about the concept of avoided cost as a proxy for value, and net energy metering in a crude way is also a proxy for value, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But there are also other benefits that we're seeing out in some of the states dealing with things like environmental benefits of DER. And with those, rather than looking at it from an avoided cost point of view, you're looking at it more from how do you monetize that benefit? And what does it mean for the compensation that the DER customer is expecting? The initial reaction, though, when you try to address these questions is from the utility perspective, the belief is DER customers don't pay their way. The costs don't match the rates. From the DER customer's perspective, the bill savings or the credits may not match the value provided. And how the parties perceive that situation, as we've seen in some of these states, has a strong impact on how adversarial the process becomes in trying to come up to a reasoned outcome on answering these questions. And as a result, in states like Arizona, Nevada, New Hampshire, now Connecticut, the debate over net energy metering has been hot and heavy. So let's look at the first side of the equation, the cost incurrence side. And I want to just go back to some basic building blocks. And while I agree with some of Paul's comments earlier about longer term, we're probably moving towards more marginal cost concepts, incremental cost. The reality is right now, here and now, we're dealing with embedded costs of a utility, and the question becomes, how do you rationalize how those costs should be ascribed to customers, DER versus non-DER customers? And so I come back to the question, or not the question, but the concept of, if I know what a customer's load characteristics look like, that gives me a pretty good indication of what their cost characteristics look like. So if I'm a high load factor customer that uses electricity day in and day out, the same rate, that's going to impact my cost differently than a low load factor customer that has peaks and valleys. And then in turn, that's going to impact what your resulting rate design looks like. And all of the bullets below really represent the factors that you need to look at in moving across those 3 building blocks. The other thing that's important not to lose sight of is the fact that the utility's revenue requirement ultimately serves as the basis for the level of rates, not necessarily how the rates are structured, but what revenues do you need to recover to give the utility a reasonable opportunity to earn its allowed rate of return. You've seen throughout Power Forward this graph, and I lay it out here more to emphasize the point that with the advent of DER customers, we now have a different paradigm that we're looking at with regard to cost, and it's the notion of bidirectional power flows that impact the design and the operational considerations for the utility grid, and as a result, that will impact the cost consequences. So now we have full requirements customers that are more traditional in nature, that need the utility for 100% of its demand requirements, and you have partial requirements customers, DER customers, that need the grid in some cases to satisfy demand, and in other cases to export electricity that's generated back into the grid. Those two aspects have very different cost implications. I do have to mention the duck curve, despite the fact that we may have been warned that we've overstayed the duck curve welcome here. But this is an example of real-world load characteristics that we've seen in some of our work that suggests that if you look at the net load shape of these solar DG customers, you can see that in the middle of the day, it's pretty clear that those customers are exporting electricity back to the grid. And so the demand that they have at their home is not sufficient to use all of that electricity, so it goes back into the grid. Well, when you look at the morning period and you look at the evening period, both of those, the magnitude of those periods are less than the midday magnitude. That has implications from a capacity allocation point of view, and that suggests that in this case, the exporting of electricity back into the grid is what's driving the fixed cost incurrence as opposed to the traditional delivery of electricity from the grid to the customer in the morning or evening hours. Taking that to a real-world example, these are 3 utilities that we've worked with over the last few years, and you can see that the delivery peak, which is the peak associated with the electricity that the utility is delivering to the customer, in all cases is less than the export peak, which says that for cost allocation purposes and perhaps for rate design purposes, the export peak is the driver, as opposed to saying, well, let's look at the net energy that customer uses over a month or over a year and conclude that if it's 0, there's no cost that they're causing to be incurred as far as the distribution grid goes. So again, the load characteristics are driving the costs in this case. Another aspect is if you look at load factor differences between typical residential customers and customers with DER, you can see there's a material difference in the magnitude of the load factor. Well, that has a bearing on what the fixed cost per unit of consumption is for full requirements customers versus partial customers. And so again, if you bring it down to the numbers, you can see that for the full requirements residential customer, there's a cost per kW that has been assigned or allocated to that particular customer for each of these utilities. And if you restate it on a volumetric basis, you can see the second column, 9 cents, 4 cents, 2 cents per kilowatt hour. In contrast, when you look at the DER residential customer, while their demand allocation may not be as high on a dollar per kW basis, when you restate it on a kilowatt hour basis, in all cases that dollar per kWh number is higher. Well, what does that mean? That means if you charge the same volumetric rate for both of those customers, one customer will be recovering its cost, while the other customer may not be recovering all of its cost, which suggests that maybe for rate design purposes, you need to treat these 2 types of customers differently. So the bottom line is, if you look at DER customers compared to full requirements customers, you have a lower annual level of electricity consumed, you have changes in terms of the timing and magnitude of peak demand, you have a lower annual load factor. All of those things contribute to a higher unit cost for the DER customer versus the full requirements customer. And because we design rates on a unit basis, the DER customer will still see a benefit by producing solar, but the costs associated with using the distribution system will not be fully recovered because of those lower load characteristics. And this is evident in the next slide, where you see that in a cost of service study that you would conduct for these three utilities, you can see that with both these customers, the full requirements customer and the DER customer, being charged the same unit rate, the same volumetric rate. In one case, the customer is a profitable customer, which means that the cost recovery is closer to the revenues. In the cases of the DER customers, you can see that there are negative returns, which indicates that there's a greater disparity between the costs that they're causing to be incurred and the revenue recovery associated with that cost. And in some of the jurisdictions, they've concluded, like in states like Kansas, that you need a separate rate class for DER customers compared to full requirements customers because of these differences. Very quickly, if we look at the avoided cost side of things, we've talked a lot this week about avoided cost of production, variable energy costs. As you go down the list, also capital and capacity investment in the T&D system and other monetized benefits. As you can see from the note on the bottom, some of these value components have broad acceptance, while others are highly contentious in terms of their inclusion in the rate and the magnitude of that component. So very quickly, you can see in this example, illustrating very simply, that while the marginal cost is highest in the evening for this particular utility, when solar is exporting into the grid, it's not hitting those high cost hours. However, if we were to compensate this customer at the high cost or the marginal cost in the evening, we would be overcompensating for the value that that customer brings to the system. With regard to T&D capacity costs, I would say that it's evolving. We've seen states like New York and California looking very closely at what is the avoided cost associated with components of the T&D system. And as you can see, the quantification is a lot more involved than perhaps looking at the production side. So what are the rate design implications? I just provide here, and you've seen this throughout the week, the pricing for utility service different than necessarily the compensation for the DER exports. And this notion of net energy metering, in my view, the rate design is the real issue, not the net energy metering. And so, for example, in this traditional rate, you can see a big chunk of that rate is energy related. The question becomes whether the utility avoids any of that cost if one less kilowatt hour is supplied on that system. And as you can see by the left part of the slide, in that energy component are a number of other costs that are viewed as fixed, yet we're treating them as if they're variable, but the utility does not save or avoid those costs at the end of the day. So as a result of that, depending on what you use as a construct on how you evaluate the value of DER, can either cause cross subsidies one way versus the other. So for example, in the left part of this slide, the value of DER, if it was based upon the net energy metering tariff or the avoided cost, you might be overvaluing DER, which means that other customers that don't have DER are subsidizing that additional load or that new load. The flip side is the other part of this table. So I think what we're seeing is a move in some of the states I mentioned from net energy metering to a value of DER tariff, where the compensation is independent of the utility's retail rates, which net energy metering is inextricably tied back to just based on the way that it operates. I present here, just for your consideration of future reference, a rate that has been in effect for a few years, Austin Energy in Texas, where they have a value of solar rate, and you can see that it's changed somewhat over the years. But the important point here is when you look at how that rate is billed, Austin Energy bills the homeowner as if the entire load requires the distribution system, so they call it their whole house load, and then the offset to that is based on the amount of electricity that's actually exported back into the grid. Whoops. And just for your information, these are the various components in that value of solar rate. So I wanted to leave you with a couple of closing thoughts here. The path forward during the transition, I think it's critically important that we have a good understanding of what are the unbundled costs of service by function, by time, and by location. Function is the easiest, time is a little more complex, and location is definitely a work in progress in states like New York and California. Also determine how the DER customer utilizes the grid and what kind of services they require, and in turn with that, quantify the true value DER brings to the utility based on avoided costs and then possibly some monetized benefits in other categories, and let the real economics of DER drive customer decisions. Finally, I think we've seen that the best rate design discussions occur outside the rate case hearing room. Stakeholder engagement is critically important. Keep the lawyers out of the room. Bring more engineers in. I think that's the best way to get some foundational consensus on the cost of grid operations and the value of DER to the grid. So with that, I will look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Russ, thank you very much. Danny?
All right, I'm Danny Wagner with Advanced Energy Economy. Thank you very much to the commissioners and for the staff for inviting me. And I've been to a few grid modernization proceedings. I have to say this one is very well organized, so kudos for that. I'm going to be speaking on rate design for DER and then rate design for mass market, specifically retail, residential customers. And so I'm going to make a transition midway through. I've been involved in a few rate design proceedings, most notably the value of DER proceeding in New York for the past 2 long years. And it has been a very interesting learning experience. You have a lot of different perspectives on how the transition should go, but in general, you see some alignment over where the end state should be in the next 10, 20 years, however long that's going to be. And also, with our members, I see lots of different ideas about current rate design based off of their own technology needs. So just as a short disclaimer, this is only my view, not the view of any of our companies in particular. But they often have a view of the end state as well that aligns pretty well in the future, but we're not at that end state. We don't have all the different pieces of the grid valued with cost causation. If the price signals are not aligned with cost causation, that's when you get the cross subsidization and cost shifts. Because DER is at the end of the line, you have to value capacity at each of the components, the distribution, transmission, and generation, and you have to align those price signals when those peaks are at those individual components of the system. You could also have ancillary services, and valuing the emissions avoidance could also be considered part of incorporating costs correctly into the system. But getting to a rate design that follows that structure is difficult from where we are now because of a lot of technology concerns and policy concerns that may not be resolvable where we are. And so I think the transition in DER rate design is more difficult than the end state. So we're going to be in this transitional period for a while, and a lot of these problems are going to be policy determinations, and it's going to be up to folks like you to figure out how to balance these concerns. I think the technology concerns have been talked about quite a bit. One that I might add that I don't think has been talked about a lot is communication from the utility to DER providers about system conditions so that they can adequately respond to those. On the policy side, once you start moving from something that's flat and like net metering to a more dynamic pay per performance rate, you're going to introduce more financeability problems, with cost of capital for this projects, and you potentially increase risk and the cost to build them. Also with distribution planning, you will need to get more data from utilities to figure out where those high value locations are and to align the price signals appropriately. So this is an example of a transition and a compromise that comes from New York. It is a very complicated rate, but basically it's export only, so any energy you produce and consume behind the meter is valued at your retail rate because you're not importing power at the retail rate. This is just for net hourly exports, and you have a capacity value that is based off of how capacity is determined in the New York ISO, and that is the peak hour in the system, which is hard to hit. In PJM, it's the 5 peak hours. It's more forgiving. So what they did to accommodate non-dispatchable technologies is they allowed them to get a per kilowatt hour capacity value that's just sort of spread like peanut butter, like normal rates, that is much more easy for them to accommodate real-time energy signals. It also incorporates distribution capacity in 2 mechanisms. One is a generalized adder that is based off of the top 10 load hours of the distribution grid. So if you hit those, you'll get a value per each hour for your exports into the grid. And working on the same principle, there's an additional adder for locational value that's based off of some expected avoidance of a utility infrastructure investment, capital expenditures that customers would otherwise had to have paid for. If DER can help avoid that, then they get value for helping avoid that cost. And last, there's some value for carbon in this through either the REC price in New York or the social cost of carbon. The thing that I'd note about this is that this is moving to more of a pay-per-performance system that introduces more risk. One developer told me that increased their weighted average cost of capital by 75 basis points, which is not insignificant. And we've seen. And that's even considering that for these large customers, this is not for residential net metering. I should have put that out here to begin with. It's for large commercial and for community distributed generation. But even considering that these are for more sophisticated customers and that this represents an increase in value from their small demand build volumetric rates, that their cost of capital goes up just because of the risk, even though their average return is increasing. So one other thing I'd note is that whether you begin a transition should probably depend on how big of a concern the operational integration of DER is, and how whether cost shifts are a concern based off of penetration. If you have really low penetration, then those concerns are not likely to be valuable relative to the cost of going through this process and developing a rate to address those. So moving on to residential rate design, I think the Commissioner Huck asked a question of a panel earlier that said, what type of rate is good for this particular customer in this situation, or another type of customer in another type of situation? And I would say it'd probably be based off of the customer's risk-reward appetite. Are they willing to respond to price signals? They can find ways to do it. They may not have automated home devices or other things, but if they have the appetite for it and the willingness, then I think that you can take advantage of that. And if you apply the same rate for everyone, then it's going to be closer to the lowest common denominator than it will be to the best value that you can get. So I think that giving some rate options to get the most from what each customer is willing to do is probably the best course of action. And I created a list here of rate designs based off of potential bill savings from a proactive customer and system benefits potential. And you can see that time of use, it's in green. That shows that it's relatively simple to understand. That is probably a good starting point because customers can understand it and also benefit, and the system also benefits from it. There are other rate designs that you can get more system benefit. At the bottom end are fixed charges. There's really no system benefit because there's nothing you could do about it. And the customer can't really lower that unless they want to disconnect from the grid. That's basically the only way you can lower a fixed charge, which is probably not the optimal action that we'd want to incentivize. So on this slide, I'd like to discuss how cost causation relates to particular demand charges. I think that in general, customers should not be on a default demand charge. I think that it would be difficult for most customers to react to, but for some customers, they may find a lot of savings for a demand charge, and they could potentially opt into a rate design with a demand charge. But there's a big difference between coincident peak demand charges and non-coincident peak demand charges. So the non-coincident peak demand charges, those are your individual peak. Whenever you use the most energy throughout the month, that's when you'll hit that demand charge, and that individual capacity relates to, that individual peak relates to individual capacity costs. Your coincident peak demand charge relates to a shared peak, right? Like when is the system in general peaking, and is a customer using power at that moment? That relates to shared capacity costs. So shared capacity costs are measured with a shared peak. Individual capacity costs are measured with an individual peak. And most residential customers only have a small amount of individual capacity that's serving them. For instance, probably on the lowest end of the scale, I live in a building with about 90 other customers, and I've gone into my meter room and looked, and I have about 10 foot of cable from the meter to a bus that is my individual capacity. And then the rest of it is shared capacity through the connection to the transformers and along the grid. So should I have a price signal as a residential customer that relates to cost causation for this 10-foot segment, or should I have a price signal, a a coincident peak demand charge that relates to the rest of the grid behind it. I think it's pretty clear that it makes sense based off of this different ratio that you see in shared capacity costs and individual capacity costs for residential customers compared to, say, a industrial or commercial customer that might have a really big transformer and really large individual capacity costs. And this is just to display the point here. I took this from a previous presentation that was a little bit more simplified, but it shows the issue here. So these are all feeder line neighbors, and Sue at 10 a.m. is using a whole lot of energy. Maybe she's getting people at the door. They're taking showers, electric water heater, et cetera. But she's not causing extra system costs because there's no system peak that's being caused here. The other neighbors aren't really using much at that time. But at 4 p.m., she's using a lot less energy, but her other neighbors are using a little bit more. They're all using the same amount of energy, and together they create a system peak that has the potential to drive up new costs. So it makes much more sense to send that price signal at 4 p.m. than it does at 10 a.m. when it's not really causing costs. So just a short point here that in order for customers to respond, they need to know how to respond. They need to know about their rate. If they don't know about their rate, they won't be very satisfied when they go on a rate that they don't know about, and you won't get the system benefits that you're hoping to get. So there are lots of ways to do that. You can, smart meter, smartphone apps, home automation, et cetera. But there's really a lot of untapped value on the table. And that brings me to my last slide. This is my own billing data on ComEd's hourly pricing program. I've been on it for a year, and I saved $111 relative to ComEd's standard rate. And this is only supply. The distribution rate is still flat volumetric. So thing to note here, the yellow is my real-time energy costs. The blue is my demand costs. So the way the rate works is every hour, based off of the 12 LMPs in the hour, they're averaged. That gives you a rate. It's real time. You don't know what the price is until the end, but that also allows customers to be more integrated with the needs of the grid rather than day-ahead prices. And the coincident peak demand charge is based off of the top 5 PJM load hours and the top 5 ComEd load hours. You average those together, that gives you a peak load contribution, and I pay for capacity based off of that peak load contribution. Currently, it's around $8 because there was someone else living in my unit in 2016. That'll switch over pretty soon, and I'll get my peak load contribution from last year's 2017's usage. I really hit my peak hours very well, and so I've quartered my peak load contribution, and so that will go down to about $2. So that's about $70 of additional savings right there baked in that is already there. So this is not me shifting costs onto other customers. This is me being plugged into the market and having my costs. I bear all of that risk, and it's being exposed to the real-time prices, and I'm covering my own costs here. It's like me basically opting out of cross-subsidization. I think that there are benefits to others, though. Once you drive down those capacity costs in the capacity market, others benefit when you drive down energy costs, LMP costs, others benefit. So it's really a win-win. You win as a customer, your neighbors win, and obviously this is not for everyone. I'm a bit of an electricity geek, so I think this is fun. Some people may not think it's fun, so it's not for them. But you give them the option. You can let people choose their risk based off of what sort of reward they're willing to take. So, or the reverse, what kind of reward risk ratio are they willing to accept? So, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. Jennifer.
Great. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Chairman, Commissioners, and staff for including us in the Power Forward process. I'm particularly excited to be here today. Just as some background framing, my remarks are going to be focusing on one aspect of rate design, something known as standby rates, that I think have some important implications or lessons for rate design generally. From the comments that I'll be providing and then by my colleague Jamie Scripps afterward, we'll be demonstrating the importance of transparency, customer education, as you heard from Danny a moment ago. Also, the importance of setting rates in a way to create incentives for the clean and efficient technologies you're looking to promote more of on the grid. My comments are also going to be focusing on not just standby rates, but also the application of standby rates to one type of technology that I think should be a key tool as you look ahead to modernizing Ohio's grid, and that is increasing the use of combined heat and power. So, as background, what I plan to cover for the next 15 minutes is one, what I call the deployment gap, kind of providing some background about CHP and its benefits, but then also talking a little bit about the tremendous potential for CHP in Ohio as compared to the level of deployment to date. I then will be talking about how standby rates are one of the barriers that's preventing the realization of this potential. I'll identify a set of best practices that can inform design of better standby rates, and as I said, that can inform rate making generally. And then I'll tee things up from my colleague Jamie, who will talk about an analysis that Five Lakes Energy has done that really kind of gets down in the weeds and looks at the specific tariffs of 3 Ohio utilities. And not to steal her thunder, but to kind of help flesh out some of the barriers and best practices as I go along, I will provide some real-world examples that we've found from that Five Lakes analysis. So let me kick things off first with just kind of a leveling the playing field slide with just what is CHP? And that's a little bit of a misnomer because the simplistic image I have here is actually of conventional power generation and not CHP at all. But the point is this, that conventional power generation is very inefficient. It's inherently inefficient. It doesn't matter what type of fuel you're talking about, whether it's coal or gas, you're going to lose roughly 60% of that fuel as wasted heat at the point of combustion. So these are the plumes of smoke coming out of your central power plants. And if you're talking about central power generation, the loss doesn't end there because you still need to get that electricity from the power plant to the end user. So nationally, you're looking at line losses averaging somewhere between 6 and 7%. We heard in the panel right before this that in Con Ed's territory, during the summer, you're looking at line losses of upwards of 9.5%. That means that at the end of the day, when you combine the wasted heat at the point of production, those transmission and distribution line losses, roughly 1/3 of your of your fuel inputs are being converted to useful output for the end user. CHP turns that inefficiency on its head so that you are producing both heat and electricity on site at the point of end use. You're capturing any waste heat to generate useful thermal energy on site. And as a result, you're operating with upwards of 60% levels of efficiency, often hitting even levels of 80% efficiency. I'm going to pause here, by the way, and apologize. My computer has a hard time communicating with others, and I swear that that little box on the right looked better on my own computer before it was converted here. I think that is I think I figured out the problem. Anyhow.
This is government, Jennifer. We only have a certain number of fonts the state allows us to have.
So GT Pressura shall be used no more in any event. Moving ahead, as I said, there is what I call a deployment disconnect in Ohio, where Ohio is 5th in the nation for technical potential for CHP, and yet 42nd nationwide in terms of levels of deployment. So that bar on the left is existing CHP projects. There are 59 projects totaling 527 megawatts of CHP in the state. The bar on the right is 14 times higher. That is the potential increase, according to Department of Energy, that we could have in combined heat and power in Ohio, well upwards of 7,000 megawatts of CHP potential. This next graphic kind of hones in on that opportunity a little bit further. The tiny little blue bars spread about, if you were to add them up, will get you your 527 megawatts of existing capacity. And those green bars, if you were to add them up, will total the upwards of 7,000 megawatts of remaining potential. And as you can see, it's kind of economy-wide. There are opportunities in both the industrial and commercial sectors throughout Ohio. But as I said, there's a big disconnect between the level of potential and the deployment. And for the rest of my remarks, I'm going to focus on what I think is one of the real reasons why we have that disconnect in Ohio. I'm not saying it's the only reason why we're not seeing full-scale deployment of CHP, but it definitely is a major burden, major barrier. And that's the problem of standby rates. A standby rate is basically an insurance policy for a combined heat and power host. So even though these folks are producing electricity on site and not necessarily needing to access the grid for large periods of time, because their systems can operate independently during extreme weather events, there are nonetheless having to pay for for grid power in the event that either they need supplemental power or if they're going to go down for a scheduled or even an unscheduled outage, as might happen. And that insurance policy is absolutely fine. The utilities should be compensated for the real costs that a CHP host creates on the grid. However, the problem comes when the standby rates are burdensome or not transparent. So I went into this process kind of naively thinking that a standby tariff was a single line item on a bill. And my work with Jamie has quickly disillusioned me with that. And I recognize that a standby tariff is actually, a collection of different riders that would apply to this distributed energy resource customer. In the case of some utilities in Ohio, there may be as many as 24 separate riders that need to be glommed together to determine what the standby tariff actually is. Now, the mere existence of several dozen riders is not in itself a problem. Arguably, it's more transparent because you know exactly what it is that you're going to be charged for. However, there are problems if it's difficult for a potential host to be able to determine what riders apply to their project. I should point out before I move on that in contrast to this list, which is just a representative sampling of the kinds of riders that would apply to a CHP customer, a conventional customer, a full requirements customer, would face only two charges, one for delivery and second, a monthly customer charge. So, as I said, having a lot of tariffs is not in itself a problem, but there is an issue when they aren't transparent. So if it's not clear, which riders are actually going to apply to your project. Another issue that we found repeatedly when looking at different utility standby tariffs is that rates are often very inconsistent. And we found this inconsistency both across utility lines within a state and then even more dramatically across states. And part of the beauty of what we call the apples-to-apples analysis, which Jamie will tell you more about, is it really allows for that comparison across utilities in a way that we've never been able to do before. And the findings were pretty dramatic. So in terms of inconsistency of rates, in Minnesota, if a 2-megawatt CHP host in one territory may pay $1,000 a month for having a system with no outages, that very same host, 2 megawatts again, no outages, might pay $5,000 a month if they're located in another service territory. The differential was not quite as dramatic in Pennsylvania, but the starting point was much higher. So in Pennsylvania, looking at PPNL versus PICO, a PPNL 2 megawatt CHP host would pay around $5,500 a month, and that same exact host would have to pay $11,000 a month if they had the misfortune of being located in PICO territory. And in Ohio, perhaps it's most dramatic. In the case of Duke Energy, a 2-megawatt CHP host might have to pay nearly $20,000 a month in standby tariffs And yet if they're in AEP territory and don't have any outages, they would not have to pay anything at all. So that differential is a $250,000 hit that a CHP host has to pay. Other issues regarding standby rates that were revealed from this analysis is the issue of captive ratepayers. You know, kind of like the logical next step based on what I was saying before was, well, you know, why don't you just move over into AEP territory or over into PPL territory? But installing a CHP system is usually, you know, something that kind of a conscientious company might be doing to cut their costs because of the energy savings that come with that increased efficiency. Maybe it's part of a sustainability commitment, but it's something that's being added onto a site that may have been located there for decades. So you're not going to up and move your university, your hospital, your paper mill to take advantage of lower standby rates. The decision isn't going to be, should I be in PPL territory or PICO territory? Rather, it's going to be, should I have a CHP system or not? And generally, because you're a captive ratepayer, the decision is going to be not. All of this then erodes economic benefits of these systems. A CHP system can lead to significant economic gains. That greater efficiency means that you have, you know, less fuel that needs to be purchased to go into the process. It lowers your energy bills over time, but it still requires a substantial upfront investment. According to EPA, you're looking at about $1,300 to $4,300 a kilowatt. And so for these 2 megawatt systems I've been talking about, you're looking at about $2.8 to $8.6 million. So it's a pretty hefty upfront cost. And if you're a business that's, you know, looking to recoup your investment in a year or two, even with big savings, you're unlikely to get there. The standby rates make it even less likely that these projects are going to pencil out. You know, if you add to that cost $250,000 that you have to pay year after year for your project, you know, it's much less likely that you're going to make the decision to invest in a CHP system. The other types of economic signals that we see kind of running amok in the analysis is that there's often not price signals in place to help encourage a CHP host to you know, schedule their outages during off-peak times. So you might not necessarily see a difference in costs for standby tariffs, you know, if they happen during the middle of the night versus the middle of a hot summer afternoon. There might not be any difference if outage is scheduled versus not scheduled. And all of those things kind of undermine the potential economic benefits and incentives or signals that a CHP host should get. The final issue I want to flag regarding standby rates that shows up in this apples-to-apples analysis is that some utilities are assuming that all rates are going to occur during peak and that every system, all CHP systems on their grid, are going to break down simultaneously. So as an initial matter, that's unlawful. It violates PURPA, which explicitly says, you know, thou shalt not assume that all outages will occur at peak and occur simultaneously. But additionally, as you see on this next slide, it's kind of a very unrealistic assumption given the tremendous reliability of a CHP system. So this is from EPA's catalog of technologies, and it's looking at a bunch of different types of CHP prime movers, different types of CHP technologies. And you can see that kind of, you know, exact reliability varies, but in general, you're looking at upwards of 95% reliability for these systems. You know, a CHP system is more reliable than the grid itself and is very unlikely to go down at all, let alone have all systems, you know, go down simultaneously and at peak. And this data is borne out after Superstorm Sandy. Department of Energy did an analysis of 24 CHP systems in New York and found that every single one of them performed as expected. In other words, if they were intended to keep the lights and power on during an outage, they did. So keeping in mind all of those issues that I mentioned, we've come up with a suite of best practices that we think could be incorporated into your rate-making process. One is, and this applies, again, not just to CHP standby rates, but is kind of, I think, a lesson that should be applied across the board, is the importance of transparency. Make sure that customers are aware of what rates apply to them, and so they're able to make more informed decisions. You want to make sure, and one of the things that I think, that's something that we think that Ohio utilities are actually doing very well, or at least some of them are. So for instance, in addition to having those disaggregated tariffs, AEP has an online bill calculator. And Dayton Power and Light now, as of November, has recently adopted the same. So that allows a CHP host to make a much more informed decision. The next best practice is that tariffs should reflect actual costs that a system is imposing on the grid. So you want to take into account actual energy use. You want to take into account the forced outage rate so that you're coming up with tariffs that actually reflect the reliability of these systems. In addition to reflecting the costs that a CHP host might impose on the grid, you should also think about the benefits that they provide in terms of reliability or reducing grid congestion. You want to eliminate something known as demand ratchets. And I know that's something I haven't talked about much, but it's definitely something that applies in Ohio. And this is where sometimes utilities will kind of punish a CHP host for having had an outage by applying an elevated rate for months, as much as an entire year following that outage, instead of taking into account the current system's actual energy use. I'm sorry, the current month's actual energy use. And the final best practice I want to highlight is the importance of giving customers choice. Customers should be able to purchase standby service on an interruptible basis if it works for their system. Now, obviously, that might work better for some hosts than others. It's possible that a hospital might not opt for interruptible standby use, but that is something that should be an option for a CHP host. You also want to have the option of purchasing backup power where market rules allow for it at prevailing market rates, not necessarily from a single utility. And I realize, in Ohio, that should be an option for generation, if not distribution. So keeping in mind the various issues that I flagged and the suite of best practices that we identified, I want to tee up Jamie's discussion about the apples-to-apples analysis. I've been working with CHP for half a dozen or so years, and we've heard about the problems that standby rates create as a barrier to entry for potential hosts, that entire time. But I never really had anything to quantify it. Part of the problem was if you call up a utility and say, what's my standby rate going to be? They'll answer for, one system, and you call up another utility, and they'll answer with a set of different assumptions, either about your system size or the number of outages you're going to have. So the apples-to-apples comparison takes a single set system, and has a set number of outage scenarios that system's run up against, so that we can, as I said before, compare the standby charges across utilities and even across states. So far, we've looked at a dozen utilities across 4 different states in Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And Jamie is going to provide some details about the findings in Ohio, looking at AEP, Dayton Power and Light, and Duke Energy, which will help you get a better sense of kind of how the Ohio utilities measure up against some of the best practices that I outlined.
Thanks. Jamie?
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us here today. It's been just such a pleasure to learn from the other experts in the room. And Jennifer, thank you for previewing so much. As I get going here, I'm going to step back a little bit. Jennifer did a great job of kind of giving you an overview of what the apples-to-apples analysis tries to accomplish. But what it really is, it's a method to calculate monthly standby charges for an identical CHP customer across different utilities. And you're able to compare levels, you're able to compare specific aspects of price signals that we can tease out with the methodology that we developed. And again, we've done this over 4 states, so the breadth of the analysis allows us to see a wide variety of good examples, examples of best practices, examples where there are areas for improvement. And where this got started is actually a best practice in itself. It started in Minnesota in a dedicated proceeding with the Public Utility Commission there. And it involved a lot of stakeholder engagement. And it was an examination of best practices in standby rates and also an opportunity for Minnesota Power, Xcel, Otter Tail, and Dakota Electric to propose revised standby tariffs based on reviewing the best practices presented. So it's been a very, it's ongoing still in Minnesota. So it's not a quick process. The conversation started in 2014, the docket began in 2015. But the conversation's been really grounded around this idea of studying best practices and then looking at proposals from the utilities and then having conversations about where they align with best practices and where they still have room for improvement. And when we started to dig into the proposals, we found that it was really hard to wrap our heads around what we were looking at. These are very complex. And not only are they complicated, and this is in Minnesota, by the way, where we actually were looking at everything on a single page. So when I get to the Ohio example, I can talk about my experience with that, although you can probably imagine. But in Minnesota, we were definitely noticing a lack of uniformity, no standardization across how the different utilities were approaching standby rates. There was even a lack of transparency there. We really had to dig to find out. The information was publicly available, but we had to dig. We had to be really resourceful. And the utilities in their filings, they provided sample calculations, but they were all different. So with billing simulations that are all different, there's no way to understand what you're looking at. So we basically said we have to create our own standardized approach. And so this is what we did. And it developed really organically. So now looking back, there are things we would do differently, but we really wanted to tease out the different kinds of outages and experiences a customer might go through. So for example, and I'll talk about what we learned along the way, but certainly a no outage scenario. So a scenario where you're you're a customer with a CHP system and it works perfectly the whole month long. You're not really taking any power, but standby service is still being reserved. So what is the cost to you as a customer? Then we look at a scheduled 16-hour outage that takes place during off-peak times. Same thing, but now on peak, and this is the one that, the scheduled outages on peak are going to be less realistic. We look at that to kind of tease out the different features of a tariff, and often we see that utilities don't even differentiate. They're not differentiating between on-peak and off-peak outages, which is an opportunity for improvement. So that's where the methodology may not seem realistic, but it's nice to know what's actually going on with the tariff there. 8 hours on peak, 8 hours off peak. We're still trying to tease out little details there. A scheduled outage that takes place 32 hours on peak, that's just trying to figure out, okay, if it's a really, really long outage, how does that affect the bill? And then finally, unscheduled. This is an important one because the difference between a scheduled outage where the utility receives advance notice and a forced outage that just happens, and it could happen on peak, off peak, the cost causation there is going to be different. And so it seems like there should be a difference in the standby charges paid by a customer between scheduled and unscheduled outages. We find that's not always the case, and so it's really important to look at that and as we have a thoughtful conversation about best practices, that's an area where price signals could play a big role in improving it. So our customer, a 2-megawatt system. We also assumed 3 megawatts of supplemental service, so the total load for this customer is 5 megawatts. That actually matters in Ohio. It didn't matter in the other states because the level of supplemental service didn't affect the bills for standby. Here, it actually came into play, so it was really important that we took that into account as well. This is general service, primary distribution, and again, we're only looking at 1 month of standby charges, so we're not teasing out the effect of demand ratchets. So just bear that in mind, that demand ratchets are definitely something you should look at. If you're looking at best practices, it's a feature you should look at. It would make anything that you're concerned about on a monthly basis, it's going to make it worse. So just bear that in mind. And I want to tell you that the process for developing these numbers, anyone here could do it themselves. I did work with the utilities. I made an effort I did a cold read of the published tariff and the rate book. I called up the utility representatives to kind of work through my interpretation, get clarification. Often utility representatives were very cordial and provided me with clarifications and helped me to understand proper application of their published tariffs. So that was great. That was a good experience overall. And then I was able to obtain the necessary data. It's a process that probably could be made better because I don't, even though I was successful in getting to what I think are, very reasonable and verified results here, I wouldn't want every potential CHP customer to have to do that. I think there's a way to streamline it, and actually the online bill calculator by AEP and DP&L is a really good step in that direction. So we looked at AEP, Duke, and Dayton Power and Light. Some highlights from the analysis: this overall standby charges are relatively high. I don't talk about the CHP incentive rebate programs here, but I think overall there's an interest from a policy perspective to understand how that side of the equation is impacted by maybe what's happening with standby rates. So just understanding that both of those exist. You have a CHP incentive program, and then you have some standby rates that are relatively high. So thinking about deployment, these are two factors. And then as you think about grid modernization overall, distributed generation is a really big part of that. So understanding standby rates and how standby rates affect deployment is key. And I think Jennifer really covered these takeaways really well, so I'm going to keep going, get to the numbers here. The numbers are a little bit small up here, but I can kind of go over some of the highlights. When I see a chart like this across the board, the first thing I look at is the no outage. This is a really critical category because this is, again, what the customer is going to be paying no matter what they do. They can't control it. Their CHP system is working perfectly. So with Duke, you have almost $20,000. That's high. That's high compared to the other utilities we've looked at within Ohio and then across state lines. Also taking a look at scheduled versus unscheduled, where you don't see a significant difference, that's an area for improvement because you really want to provide a price signal to incent scheduling maintenance ahead of time. You certainly don't want to disincent maintaining your system from an overall grid perspective. You want there to be scheduled, proactive maintenance of these CHP systems. So you can see the comparison and, frankly, just the wide variation across the utilities. This is from a customer perspective. This is kind of all over the map. Oh, and then, so in Ohio, so we were comparing with Minnesota and Michigan, and of course in Ohio, there's the very real issue of the fact that industrial customers shop for generation, or they commonly can shop for generation. So the question is, does that solve this? And the answer is really no, it doesn't, because we looked at the numbers, we took out the generation, we took out the we took out basically anything that wasn't distribution and transmission related, and you still have the same issues, really. The numbers come down a tiny bit, but the same underlying issues are there. So it really bears scrutiny, even in the market structure that we have here in Ohio. So when you look at reservation charges, and that's the term that we use for what's happening in that no outage month, the cost to the customer for just having the standby service on standby, right? You're reserving it. It's kind of like an insurance policy, like Jennifer said. And so it's commonly called a reservation fee. A best practice that I'd ask you to consider is somehow factoring in the CHP system's forced outage rate into calculating the charge that the customer has to pay. This takes into account the reliability of the system, and it avoids those super high charges in a no outage month that can really pose a barrier. And here you see the comparison of the reservation fees throughout the analysis, so in other states as well. And I would point out Minnesota Power as an example of where you have that best practice in application. They use the forced outage rate in calculating the reservation fee. And for our sample system, the 2 megawatt CHP system, the reservation charge is about $1,000. So really small compared to what you're seeing from other utilities. Demand charges, this is actually where the big problem arises with standby rates, really, because even when you get into the outage scenarios, if you're not differentiating between scheduled and unscheduled, and if you're not prorating based on the length of time of the outage, then standby customers are really getting hammered with huge demand charges. And so what we'd like to see with outages is if you're going to apply a demand charge, it should be prorated based on the number of hours of the outage rather than rounded up to the day. So we really like to see that proration, and when we see these high numbers, it's really an indicator that you're not prorating for the standby customers. So Jennifer did a really nice job talking about customer accessibility, but I've sort of lived through this process, and I can tell you that transparency is the first step, and I think actually in Ohio, you're doing a really wonderful job with transparency. It's almost an overwhelming level of transparency, but that's great. Don't take that away. That's a great first step. And what we need to do now is then take that transparency and build a bridge to the customer so that they can actually use the information. And it's a principle of good rate design that these rates should be uncontroversial as to interpretation, and that comes across in the language and the presentation of the rates as well. So customer friendliness, as we think about the evolving role of the customer, this isn't just about standby rates. Like this is something that can benefit all customers. You've got a lot of riders in Ohio, a lot, and that is actually not something you see in every state. So just understanding that in Ohio, your challenge in terms of customer friendliness might be a little bit bigger, and so you just have to make it a little bit easier on your customers in that way. And then this just gives you a flavor. This is not going to be news to anyone here. This is the number of riders that you have to total up. And so what were some of the big takeaways for the various utilities? In AEP, in the case of AEP, they did have higher than average demand charges for the outage scenarios when there were on-peak outages. And there were high charges for a standby customer when that standby customer was not also taking supplemental service. So that can affect the customer deciding how big their CHP system is going to be. So just if that's the way the rates should be designed, great, but be intentional about it, and that's something we just wanted to flag. And Dayton Power and Light actually has made recent revisions to their SSO, and I talked about generation earlier. The real action here is not with the generation riders, but there can be improvements, and certainly in the case of DP&L, they recently revised their generation riders to take out the demand charges, and that actually really helps the numbers here. So we are already seeing some improvement, and I'd say it's a really good start. There's still work to be done with DP&L. They actually don't have their own dedicated standby tariff, so that would be a great first start. If they're willing to do that, they should be applauded for that. That's wonderful. We also see with DP&L high charges when the standby customer doesn't take supplemental service, so that same issue from AEP. And then this lack of a distinction between scheduled and unscheduled outages, that definitely that's just a red flag. When we see that, that feels like something that could be fixed relatively easily based on a cost of service study, and it would be a huge help to a customer looking at CHP. And then for Duke Energy, the level of standby charges were very high compared to everyone else in the comparison. And a lot of this is because their charges were based on contract capacity and not prorated at all based on actual usage or duration of an outage. And again, the scheduled versus unscheduled differentiation really needs to be there in order to provide the right price signals. So I'll conclude by just saying this was a great exercise from the very beginning because it started from the idea that let's engage stakeholders. It was started in Minnesota, but then in Michigan, they had a standby rate working group too, and they wanted to take a look at this analysis. And the reason it's helpful is because stakeholders want to engage, but we have to get our heads around what we're looking at. And so this is a great place to start. The conversation doesn't end here. The conversation starts here, and then great questions are asked, and the perspective of the utility is also very, very important in this as well. And so we talk about cost of service. We talked about cost causation. And in Minnesota and Michigan, we've had great progress in just grounding the conversation in ways that maybe previous to this weren't as possible. So I'd say it's about stakeholder engagement and thinking about innovative ways that we can really reform rate design to enhance the customer experience. So by shining a light on the impacts of various standby rate approaches, in this case, we were trying to ensure that customers, regulators, and utilities all have the tools to engage in a meaningful way. And I think that that can be a lesson across the board as Ohioans move to a cleaner, more resilient grid. So thank you so much.
Jamie, thank you very much. Thanks to all of our panelists. Wonderful panel. Let's open up the floor for questions. Christina?
I'll start with a couple CHP questions since we kind of ended there. First, can I take it that you like First Energy's standby tariff since it was not included?
We don't know.
So that is a great question, and I should have explained this. So we did attempt to include First Energy. They would have been a really important utility to include in the analysis. At the utility coordination stage, when I picked up the phone and called them, they requested to not be included. And I honored that request. I think it was because they were in the middle of pending revisions. So I did indicate to them that I would love to come back, and when those revisions are complete, let's take a look. So I hope that they'll take us up on that offer.
Yeah. And just kind of quickly from a staff perspective, I think with the generation piece of standby rates, we did notice that historically we had tariffs on the books that were referencing capacity reservation charges for generation from when we were still vertically integrated in the state. It's been a little slow process, but those have been getting updated for each EDU, and they're now linked to the SSO rates, which in themselves are 3 riders generally for energy capacity and then the reconciliation rider. But those are sort of based on actual KWH usage, so they're sort of prorated in a way. So I think that's where you see some of the benefit on the generation side. And then I would also add, we recently had, in our compliance with PURPA rule, we sort of linked the payment to qualifying facilities, which I would imagine a lot of these CHP facilities are eligible, the payment to those facilities to the LMP rate within the kind of closest point of interjection or the zonal kind of average rate. And I guess, did you guys look at the payments to these facilities at all in this kind of holistic review of what they're paying, but also kind of credits they may be getting from the PURPA tariffs?
No, we haven't looked at that. That definitely is the other side of the coin, and it's an important factor that the customer is going to consider. We looked at standby rates, on their face, just because, you really can't, when you look at standby rates and rate design, you really can't take into account a CHP incentive program. You really can't take into account, well, standby rates are really exorbitant here, but they're getting it all back with buyback rates. Like, I think you want to be thoughtful about rate design on both sides of the coin. But you're right, like there's a big picture here, and we really need to understand all the pieces.
And just saying, those changed in the last couple years, so maybe worth looking at into what they're being paid at.
Sure.
And then more generally, I mean, do these facilities participate in wholesale demand response markets currently, or does it vary by state?
To some degree, I don't have the numbers, but I do think that you can sell, yes, they do participate in PJM to some degree.
And then I just had another question. Sorry, I have a
No,
list
no,
of them.
go,
But for
please.
Danny, let's see what was it? I think you were the one that mentioned the New York kind of value of DER. How long are those rates actually in effect? We talked about kind of earlier today net metering and the risk of being an early adopter to certain rate designs or compensation methods and how that may change over time. Just curious how long that's planned to be in effect for.
So that rate itself is transitional, the one that I pointed to. So they're trying to, at the moment, improve upon it. That'll be a process. But this transitional rate is only applied to new projects that are interconnected since the order came out. So the projects that were under net metering are still under net metering. And they did that because they said, well, these developers decided to install these projects based on the economics of the time. They did not freeze the rate, but they have kept them on that same rate design and have not shifted them over to this new rate design. But they have the option, one-time option, to elect to move into this new value of DER. So.
Tammy?
Just a couple quick ones. I think, Jennifer, you had mentioned, I think, 527 or 572, I can't remember, megawatts of CHP. I'm sure my colleague Christina perhaps knows this number, but I do not. Is that broken up by utility, or do you have the numbers in
I could
terms?
easily follow up with you to break up by utility.
But it is spread across the utilities?
Yeah, it's spread across utilities, and it's also spread across, actually, if you go to the next slide, you can see that it's, this isn't the geographic distribution, this is the economic distribution, but those 527 megawatts are across 59 projects. It includes ArcelorMittal in Cleveland, it includes the University of Cincinnati, but DOE maintains a database with the precise locations of all of the projects. So it would be easy enough to determine what utility service territory they each fall into. And I feel like the logical next question is, are they clustering in some service territories and not others?
That is why I was asking.
So
I was
it would be
curious.
fun to map it. I could get back to you.
Okay, no, I appreciate that.
And I will say in Minnesota, as part of that proceeding, that was part of what was brought out, and that each utility kind of talked about how many customers they had on standby, and so it's a very relevant data point.
And Danny, just a quick question. You were talking about demand charges for residential customers. I wasn't sure if that was something you supported. I just wanted to get your take on that. And then, do you know of any other states that are using demand charges for residential customers?
So on the first part, I recommended that it should ever be default for customers, and that some customers may benefit from demand charges, but between the two types of demand charges you have, the non-coincident peak and the coincident peak, because of the split of shared versus individual capacity costs, it's only the coincident peak demand charges that make sense for residential customers if they were to decide to elect to have one. And in regard to mandatory demand charges for IOUs, I think the only utility that currently has a mandatory demand charge for residential customers is Eversource with their new demand charge for solar customers. So they have a non-coincident peak demand charge for solar customers, but that could be knocked over by the legislature sometime soon.
Well,
So,
I would also mention that Arizona Public Service has a optional residential demand charge rate, and Salt River Project in Arizona, not an IOU obviously, has a residential demand charge rate as well.
in terms of non-IOUs, there are a few utilities that have mandatory demand charges. It's Cobb County Electric Membership Cooperative in Georgia has a coincident peak demand charge for residential customers that they've had for a few years. And so it is the one that we think makes sense, but should be optional.
Just a couple questions. This is probably going to sound like a silly question. How hard is it to determine what a utility's fixed charge should be? How hard is it to determine how much should be the fixed component of forget even billing, okay? Let's just talk about it theoretically. How hard is it to determine that dollar amount that is necessary for the utility to maintain reliable service?
Chairman, I think where we may get tripped up at times is because of the sort of snapshot in time use of a revenue requirement to
Right.
determine a utility's total cost of service. We look at that snapshot in time, that 12-month period, and we say, those T&D costs are fixed, and as a result, we need to recover them in a fixed component of the rate. I think, as Paul talked about earlier today, with the recognition that perhaps marginal cost should be a component or an aspect to look at going forward, you start asking the question, what is the change in costs of the T&D system look like on a forward-looking basis? So you start getting into planning and other kinds of capital expansion questions. So again, going back to the snapshot in time, I think there's general recognition that for both an electric utility and a gas utility, if you just look at the distribution part of the business, the pipes and wires, the bulk of that cost is fixed.
And so then where we get hung up is, well, the first area where you get hung up in is as the grid evolves, and we've brought up the battery storage example a number of times in front of the meter. You know, as the grid evolves, what does our typical rate making regime associated with the revenue requirement, you know, how does that conceptually evolve that that very standard process? And I think for our purposes, I mean, this is the determining base rates. I mean, it is a statutorily standardized process. And then I think when you then start talking about, you know, socializing those costs amongst amongst customers, that to me in my mind always gets a little jumbled, because we've talked today about we've got customer charges, and then we use the words fixed charges, and then we've talked about various ways to utilize rate design through straight fixed variable or decoupling, and, you know, possibly get out of the volumetric component of this. And so I think in thinking about retail rate design, and as we advance the modern grid, I don't know that there are easy solutions here, because statutorily we've got a regime on the books. We understand that the grid is going to evolve and change, but how you account for that within a very typical rate making regime is really to me is really, how do you account for like the potential efficiencies and then pass that on to customers is really the challenge here. I think I'm just talking,
Well,
but
I think part of the challenge is just like cost of service and rate design. I think in a way price signals also are all in the eyes of the beholder. I mean, if my singular desire is to have a strong price signal for customers to consume less, why don't I just take the revenue requirement of the utility and divide it by the kilowatt hours and get one rate for everyone? Well, the reason I don't do that is for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a skewed price signal, because essentially what you're saying to the customer is, this higher unit cost, if you use one less unit of electricity, the utility is avoiding that same level of cost. And the reality is they're not, because those costs that are recovered volumetrically by the choice of the commission, the parties, whoever, are trying to recover fixed costs. So there's a mismatch. And in fact, that's why revenue decoupling came into being, because you were trying to recover fixed costs through the volumetric part of the rate. And revenue decoupling, in my mind, is an after-the-fact adjustment to take care of the ills that you didn't address by getting the rate design right in the first place.
are you in favor of revenue decoupling?
I think revenue decoupling has a place if the conclusion is that you can't get the rates to exactly reflect the underlying cost. And you know, when you think about the advent of revenue decoupling, it started on the gas side of the business back in the late 90s in Maryland. The Maryland Commission concluded that BG&E could not forecast its volumes on a forward-looking basis, and they said because of that uncertainty, we can't determine whether the unit costs that become the unit rates are in fact reasonable or not. So we're going to allow the utility to adjust rates after the fact. Come 2000, come 2003, 4, 5, gas prices started going up, and there was a recognition that energy efficiency was an important element of utility businesses, and there, the impetus behind revenue decoupling was we've got to break the link between revenues and sales. We've got to take away that disincentive for the utility to provide energy efficiency programs. So we saw in 2005, 6, 7, 8, a number of states adopted revenue decoupling. But a state like Missouri didn't on the gas side. Instead, and in Ohio, the same thing, you adopted straight fixed variable rate design for the gas utilities. So you aligned the variable costs with the variable portion of the rate. So if volumes went down, there wasn't much of a decrease in the cost, so the revenues stayed relatively stable and continued to allow the utility to earn its allowed rate of return.
If I could add on here, I think that there are some costs that are customer specific, and those probably should be recovered on a customer specific basis. But most of the other costs are demand related, right? And those costs that are sunk, basically the embedded costs, are not fixed costs, they are long run costs. So while they may be unchangeable for the current planning cycle for the utility, maybe that's 5 years, let's say you have some energy efficiency that has a really long lifespan. So what you have done is you've lowered demand on the system for the long term, and you may in 10 years avoid an upgrade that you would have had to have taken had that energy efficiency not been there. So that fixed, taking those embedded costs and just making them fixed doesn't account for that, right? It doesn't account for the fact that you still want to provide a signal for customers to do things that are beneficial to the system. And so it's really what you can do with with your revenue requirement to divide it up in the right way to make sure you're getting the results that you want. I do think utilities should always collect their revenue requirement so long as it's properly constructed. I think that always makes sense. And a rate design should always try to accomplish that goal.
I mean, in any state where the commission requires the conducting of a marginal cost study for purposes of guiding rate design, they are stuck with the same dilemma that you could set rates based on that forward-looking view of what is the change in cost, but you're always brought back very quickly to the reality that you've got T&D costs that are sunk, they're embedded, and somehow you need to find a way to recover that through prices to enable the utility to have a reasonable opportunity to earn its allowed rate of return because the revenue requirement was set on that basis.
So how do we break this logjam between the virtue of straight fixed variable as far as reflecting what the current costs are of service, that's a better way to do it. It aligns the rate with the type of the cost, at least in the medium term, the short and medium term. But as Danny points out, it doesn't provide any pricing signal to match what the longer run marginal opportunities might be for reducing those fixed costs over the long run. How do we manage, or how do we bridge that, or how do we recognize that potential, the forward-looking reduction in costs? If you take a forward-looking view that costs can be reduced, how do we signal to consumers to go ahead manage their consumption so that in the longer run, it matches up, their behavior matches up what the longer run opportunities for reducing costs might be.
Well, I think Paul addressed some of that in his presentation, and at the end, he said, you know, you've got these residual T&D costs that you might not be able to recover if you price on a marginal cost basis. And I think his conclusion was you would try to recover that residual amount of cost in the least disruptive way so that you don't undermine the price signals that you're trying to give to customers by using marginal cost or that forward-looking perspective.
So I take it that you're in an imperfect world where we currently live, your inclination is to go to straight fixed variable for utility systems whose costs are primarily fixed or not avoidable in this medium term, as opposed to using a volumetric rate and then truing it up with some sort of lost revenue or revenue decoupling mechanism.
To me, that addresses the root cause of the reason or the problem why we needed revenue decoupling in the first place. Having said that, though, I am a strong believer that we want to identify the costs and identify them in as objective a way as possible. And if we want to impose non-cost considerations in the design of rates because of gradualism, impacting low-income customers, any and all of those non-cost considerations, let's call it that and make that adjustment as opposed to trying to infect the cost analysis to try to get us to a result that we want for rate design.
And the infection is the revenue decoupling approach, right?
Well, to me, the revenue decoupling approach is an after-the-fact adjustment to cure the fact that you have a mismatch in the embedded costs and the way that you recover them.
Just two sentences. I think you can do this in a way to recover past costs while also being forward-looking. You don't want to go to a complete system where you avoid those forward-looking price signals, because then you lose that future potential. So I think finding a way to maintain that, even if you have a bit of a mismatch there with revenue decoupling, it can be worth it for the purpose of what you're getting out of it from the future.
So a little bit of revenue decoupling could be worthwhile?
Well, I don't think you can do a little bit of revenue decoupling, I think. But I think it is worthwhile, yes.
I did have one more question, which is, Danny, your slide 4 and all of the different potential residential rate design options. I guess my question is actually to the staff, which is how practical is the choose your own rate design from I mean, it sounds nice, but can that be done based upon our?
I mean, we have pilot programs for all of these. I think part of the challenge, and I think this was brought up by someone either today or prior day, but we have this competitive bidding process, and I think our SSO rates really align with the products that we've developed, and Dr. Schwege can speak to this much better than I can, but the SSO rates for energy and capacity now are really more aligned to the products that have developed through that. So any offset would be recovered through a reconciliation rider, for better or worse. I mean, you could do all of these really still now. It's all just, it's within our purview of rate design,
Okay.
right?
Other questions?
Jamie, could you explain, I noticed on your slide about the reservation charges in other states, I mean, they're really all over the map. Is there any rhyme or reason? I know we kind of talked about why Ohio's might be where they are, but is there some rhyme or reason? How do the other states come up with their numbers? Do you know?
Yeah, I think just the simplest way to get your reservation fee down and aligned with best practices and what we think would align with cost of service is so basically you're taking kind of a demand charge rate and you're multiplying it by the contract capacity, so the size of your CHP system. If you just stop there, that's a really big number. And some utilities stop there and they charge that for the reservation fee. Some then actually then multiply it by the forced outage rate of the CHP system, which Jennifer covered this. It can be like 5% is kind of a conservative number. It can even be lower than 5%. So if you're multiplying, that larger, sum by the forced outage rate, which is a measure of reliability, that's a way of getting the reservation fee down. So where you see the smaller numbers, it's factoring in some of that reliability. It also is it's somewhat determined by that demand charge rate, so it's going to be based on underlying cost of service as well.
So, I apologize, because I don't recall if you mentioned this during your presentation. The disconnect within Ohio between like AEP and Duke is explained in part because of the assumptions of the analysis, assuming had there not been 3 megawatts of supplemental power. Could you walk through
Sure,
that difference?
yeah,
I think
so
that's kind of I think this is a fascinating explanation for the disparity of reservation fees.
So where you're seeing 0 for AEP, that does change if the CHP system for the customer is sized to meet their full load. In that case, AEP does charge in a no outage scenario. So in that, it would be interesting. I would love to talk to them more about the underlying cost of service reasons for that differentiation. It's not something we saw in the other states. So it is something, not only does, from the customer perspective, it creates price signals for how you size your system, but I'm just curious from a cost of service perspective how they came up with that, because it is a difference, so there must be a reason, and that would be a good follow-up question for them, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? No. He said no, Larry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you heard the adage, save the best for last. Well, that's not what's happening here. Just more a statement maybe than with a question embedded in it. We talk about the value of DER, and your graph pertained to solar as the DER. The question I have, I guess, is, you want to get the value right, but, it's to cover ultimately a revenue requirement. So it's a value with, in the eyes of the beholder. So are we valuing it right for the utility? Are we valuing it right for the market? Are we valuing it right for the aggregator? Or are we valuing it right for the consumer? And here's why I'm driving to that. There is an embedded value, I think, in the eyes of the consumer for solar. There's an environmental component that I assume carries a value. And I'm wondering if you have any empirical data whatsoever that indicates, is that a driving consideration? Is it more important that it gets priced right, it's a money saving, or is it a contribution to a positive environmental benefit?
Yeah, I have not personally looked at sort of consumer attitudes to try to ferret out, which is the driving force. But what I would say is that I think what we're seeing is an evolution in how you might determine what the value is, because, when we first saw DER come on the scene, we used net energy metering as sort of a rough justice way to say that reflects the value, and it may or may not have been true, because that avoided, or that credit on the bill was inextricably tied to the underlying utility rate, and it didn't necessarily correlate with the value of other things related to what kind of cost could be avoided in the future, what would be the environmental benefit of DER versus traditional generation. I think now we've seen the process evolve, and some states have moved away from net energy metering after perhaps they concluded that the market was kick-started and there's enough out there and there's enough penetration of DER to go to the next step. And I see that next step as trying to refine the value proposition of DER, but at the same time not losing sight of the fact that DER as a load still imposes certain costs on the T&D system. And that's why I was, in my slides, trying to point out, perhaps one way to look at this is sort of two components of a transaction. One is, what does it cost to be able to continue to satisfy the residual needs of the DER customer, and then ask yourself the question, what is the value proposition associated with the electricity that's generated that goes back into the grid? And I think some states are starting to look at it that way. This Austin Energy example that I mentioned is one way that that has been done. Minnesota has also looked at that, and New York is looking at it as well.
Okay, thank you.
Dan?
Just one follow-up question to Commissioner Friedman's line, Russ and Danny, if you have something to say about it. The Austin example that you provided has some appeal to it to me because it's relatively simple. You figure out what the premises consumption is, charge it like it's a regular traditional customer, but then pay it for all the value of the solar production that it's putting into the grid as a separate matter. The question I had as far as mechanically doing that, do you have to have 2 meters, or is a smart meter adequate to do both things, both the measuring with the total consumption at the premises on the one hand and the output to the grid on the other?
Yeah, good question. In the case of Austin Energy, they actually have 2 meters to be able to measure the total solar output or production, and then the more traditional meter to be able to meter the total demands of that particular location.
Do you have any idea whether or not it's possible to use these advanced metering devices to do both things at once?
Yes, most smart meters are two-way, so that they basically have 2 different buckets. They have total imports, total exports, and you can net it on any sort of time component that you want, whether it's over a month or over an hour. You can do that netting.
But I mean, I don't want to net it here, Danny. I want to measure all the use in the house on the one hand, the premises on the one hand, and then measure the total amount of the photovoltaic output on the other. Is that possible?
Yeah, in that case, you just would not net it.
Now, the one thing I would say, Commissioner, is that while there may be a certain degree of simplicity in seeing how Austin Energy did it, the reality is they have spent a good deal of time trying to determine the appropriate value for that export amount. And, you saw in the slide that amount has changed over time, not only with changes in the underlying cost of energy at the generation level, but also changes in the philosophy of how you value some of these components.
But it does in a way, it makes explicit the judgment that's going on about what is the value of the contribution from the DER. And so that has some appeal also. It may be a hard decision to make, but it's probably one that if you're not making it explicitly, you're making it implicitly through the other methods that we've used.
If I could just add, the way that Austin does it is they have a per kilowatt hour fixed amount that they provide in terms of compensation for the total generation of the solar. What New York does is they have, well, here are the values, and here's how we're going to calculate them, and they're very time and location based, but it's not specific to solar. So whoever can show up and provide those values, if they perform well according to the rate, then they can compete better, basically. So it's more of a way of developing a market, though it definitely is complicated and has its difficulties.
Mr. Chairman, I just have one little comment or question in that, you know, we're talking about DERS and talking about kind of a base rate in times when you could probably look back upon this time as having, you know, cheap energy. And, you know, the discussion possibly changes when the cost of energy rises. But you know, I think all of us are concerned about people that will never use DERS. Well, first of all, we're people that use DERS. We're concerned about those and think that they ought to have a opportunity, and we think of that more people using it, much more people in the future. But secondly, also those people that, for one reason or other, never will have, at least DERS that I'm thinking of. They won't have solar on their houses, or they can't afford it, or they can't, you know, things of this sort. And so, you know, I don't know if you have anything, you've been talking about it a good bit here, about any suggestions you might have as far as, given today's world, what, you know, keeping these things separate. You know, I've talked to folks that have DERS. They're very concerned about paying for things that they don't like this fixed cost. They're working to keep their utility rate low, and they have some basic costs that, and then the other folks that do not have DERS, you know, they don't want to be paying for something that they don't perceive of them directly benefiting.
I have an example, and that is the savings that I was able to get from the ComEd real-time pricing. I did that without any automation. I have a phone that alerts me when the prices are high. Other than that, I have to walk over to my electric heaters, which use a lot of electricity, and turn them off. And that's what I did to create that savings. So it required no upfront investment, but the rate design allowed the opportunity to save and to participate.
Well, by the way, that example was very good. I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I think he's giving me too much information, but it was, it turned out to be very beneficial.
Well, the other thing I'll mention is the benefit of solar specifically. If you look at the municipal utility market, we're seeing a lot of development of community solar. I think in part because municipal management looks at their customers differently than maybe an IOU, that perhaps the customers almost in a sense have an ownership stake in the municipal operation, and they feel as though there's a responsibility to provide the benefits of solar through that type of community solar arrangement.
Please thank our panelists. Thank you very much. Okay, so that concludes 12 days of Power Forward. I do want to close with a few comments. The first thing I want to do, Beth, thank you for your leadership. Really appreciate everything that you've done. Commissioners, thank you for your attention and care and preparation and thoughtful questions. I mean, this is not, I would say this is not normal. I mean, what the amount of attention that you have and care that you have put into preparing for and just being engaged from start to finish is really something to be admired. So I'm really grateful for it. I know the state's really grateful for it. This is not the time to get nostalgic, but when I was thinking to myself yesterday when I went off on my little soliloquy about with our last panel, and when I was sworn in as chair in May of 16, we think about that. We were dealing with PPA remands, okay, and this is March of 2018, and look at the conversation that we have started here, and I'm really just really grateful to everybody up here for that support and for just the amount of care that they've put into it. This is like Beth, for some reason I've been obsessed with the Avengers lately. I think it's because I saw Black Panther is very good. I keep on messaging Beth here about, are you going to go see the Avengers? Are you going to go see the Avengers? It's like regulatory Avengers up here. Like the amount of talent that we have assembled in a short period of time, Howard Petrikoff included, and the existing folks that have just put so much attention and care into this proceeding has just been incredible to watch. Christina Schaefer, you're a star. You know it, we know it. It's well done on all things that you've done here. Kristen Klingon, who is sitting in the very, very back of the room, diligently taking notes. Look, in any organization, there are like these rare snapshots in time. I've seen it happen a couple of times in my career where, somebody is just there and they're doing the work and they're kind of flying under the radar, and then there's an event or there's some opportunity and someone just grabs it and is like, I'm going to own this. I'm going to own the work associated with this. And if it succeeds, then I succeed. And if it fails, then I fail. And Kristen did this, and with a lot of work and diligence and effort. And I hope you know that you've made your mark on the agency, and you should feel really proud of that. So thanks to Kristen.
She's my aide, by the way.
She is.
Works in my office, but
she
yes, she's the person that has totally taken this up and has, without any kind of direction, just knew what to do. And those are very rare people that can just jump in and take action. So, Kristen, thank you.
Really well done. The public affairs team, which has really just stepped up its game incredibly. The director, Kim Norris, the deputy director, Matt Schilling, Jeff McNaughton, Jill Coker, Brittany, whose last name I'm forgetting, Waggoner, I believe. They first of all, they're very active. They're down here a lot. They're just very active with the event, but they have really stepped their game up as far as the marketing and publicity and just getting the messaging out associated with Power Forward. So really well done. The aides, all of our commission aides. Kristen is one of those aides. My aide, Bethany Allen, Larry's aide, Rachel Maines, Tom's aide, John Ryan, Dan's aide, Andy Schaefer. These guys worked really hard, especially as the week hit. These guys worked really, really hard to make the event, to make all of this successful. And then all of our staff that participated, regardless, and I'll address the final product here in a second, regardless of what the final product looks like, just think about what we've done here. We have, over the span of, close to a year, we have created what is essentially a knowledge bank, a foundational knowledge bank for this agency going forward. We're not looking at, a piecemeal filing here or a piecemeal filing there and trying to figure out how it fits into the broad scheme. We have really established a foundation for grid modernization knowledge here at the agency. And we fully know that this is going to be iterative. We fully know that we will not have it all figured out right now, but the base that we have established for hopefully decades of work associated with this space is really, I think, something that we should all be very, very proud of, and I think something that will benefit the agency. So let me talk about the product associated with this. So folks keep asking me, You know, will it just be summaries? Will it be are you going to make some serious decisions on various facets of grid mod going forward? Are you going to create further avenues for further exploration? And I would say all of the above. Okay, so while we have to collectively decide what that final product would look like, I would expect that there will be elements of all of that in a final product that the PUCO puts out. And also there has to be an understanding that this is not the end. I don't know that we'll do something like this again in the near term, but this is not the end for these discussions. It's going to take a lot of dialogue. It's going to take a lot of stakeholder input. But for establishing that base foundational knowledge, this was necessary and I think went just extraordinarily well. So that's it from me. Anyone else? Everybody ready to get out of here? Okay. Thanks so much to everybody who watched at home and to everybody in the room as always. We're adjourned.